At dinner, my son said loudly, "You are a loser, but my mom's new husband is not." I did not say anything. A week later, he was without a car money and a roof over his head. And in the evening, my ex called me in a panic. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Howard Garrison, 67 years old, and I spent my entire adult life as a commercial underwriter, analyzing the hidden risks of the world. Tonight, I found myself sitting at the far end of a sprawling mahogany dining table in a luxury suburban home in Connecticut. The house belonged to my son, Evan Garrison, though that was a legal technicality only I fully understood. The dining room was suffocatingly warm, filled with the booming laughter of Julian Vance, the man my ex-wife Brenda had married 15 years ago, after she decided my practical life lacked the ambition she required. Julian Vance was holding court at the head of the table, waving a crystal glass of $400 wine while detailing his latest offshore investment acquisitions. Evan Garrison sat to his right, hanging on every word Julian Vance spoke, desperate for the approval of a man who wore custom suits and drove imported cars. Beside Evan Garrison sat his wife, Chloe Garrison, who nodded enthusiastically at Julian Vance, while offering me nothing more than a tight, obligatory smile when I first arrived. The spread of food before us was extravagant, catered by a local chef, but I only had a glass of tap water in front of me. Julian Vance noticed this and paused his monologue to point his glass in my direction. He asked if the tap water was a new retirement diet or if I simply lacked the palate for European imports. Laughter rippled across the table. Brenda smirked, adjusting a heavy diamond necklace that caught the ambient light of the chandelier. I did not answer him. I did not explain that I could not process alcohol because my liver had been permanently compromised 30 years ago. I did not remind Brenda that I sustained that chemical damage by working consecutive double shifts at a processing plant, inhaling toxic fumes to afford the copays for the 6 reconstructive spinal surgeries Evan Garrison required when he was 7 years old. Evan Garrison now sat with a perfectly straight spine, drinking expensive wine, mocking the man who had traded his own health to ensure his son could walk. I maintained a blank expression and took a slow sip of the cold water. The occasion for this gathering was Evan Garrison earning a promotion at his corporate sales job. Julian Vance decided this required a grand gesture to initiate Evan Garrison into what he called the real world of wealth. Julian Vance stood from his chair, silencing the room, and reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He spoke grandly about how winners recognize winners and how playing it safe was for people who wanted to die average. He locked eyes with me when he said the word average. Then he tossed a heavy leather pouch across the table. It landed directly in front of Evan Garrison. Evan Garrison ripped the pouch open and pulled out a set of keys bearing the emblem of a high-end German sports car. Julian Vance announced that he had personally covered the down payment and fast-tracked Evan Garrison into his private wealth management fund to cover the monthly installments. Evan Garrison leapt from his chair, rushing around the table to embrace Julian Vance like a conquering hero. Chloe Garrison shrieked with delight, clapping her hands and rushing to hug Brenda. I remained seated. I reached into my coat pocket and withdrew a small worn velvet box. Inside rested a vintage mechanical watch. It was a timepiece I had spent the last 6 months meticulously restoring by hand, sourced microscopic gears from across the country, rebuilding the escapement mechanism night after night. It was a quiet, enduring piece of craftsmanship meant to signify time, patience, and the lasting bond between a father and a son. I waited for the commotion to die down, then slid the velvet box across the polished mahogany. It stopped inches from the car keys. Evan Garrison returned to his seat. He looked down at the velvet box, opened it, and stared at the silver watch. His face, previously flushed with excitement, dropped into a mask of profound disappointment. He did not pick it up. He pushed the box aside with the back of his hand, letting it slide dangerously close to the edge of the table. He looked directly into my eyes, the entitlement rolling off him in waves. He leaned forward and projected his voice so every person in the room could hear it clearly. "You are a loser, Dad. Mom's new husband actually knows how to win." The words struck the room, ringing out with undeniable cruelty. Brenda let out a short, sharp laugh, bringing her wine glass to her lips to hide her triumphant smirk. Chloe Garrison giggled, leaning into Evan Garrison's shoulder, whispering that the watch looked like something purchased at a flea market. They all waited for my reaction. They expected a red-faced outburst, a desperate plea for respect, or an angry defense of my gift. They wanted to witness the pathetic breakdown of an obsolete patriarch. I denied them that satisfaction. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend the 6 months of labor poured into the watch. I stood up slowly, ensuring the legs of my chair did not scrape loudly against the hardwood floor. I picked up my linen napkin, folded it into a perfect square, and placed it neatly beside my untouched plate. I looked at Evan Garrison one last time, recognizing that the boy I had sacrificed my body for was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow shell of greed. Without a single word, I turned my back to the table and walked out of the dining room. The silence I left behind was heavier than any insult I could have thrown. I moved down the long carpeted hallway toward the front door, slipping my arms into my worn trench coat. As I reached for the brass doorknob, a detail on the entryway credenza snagged my attention. A thick leather-bound financial prospectus lay open, carelessly discarded by Julian Vance when he arrived. My instincts, honed by 3 decades of hunting commercial fraud and shadow corporate ledgers, flared instantly. I paused, stepping closer to examine the open page. The document detailed the offshore investment fund Julian Vance was using to finance Evan Garrison's new lifestyle. I scanned the dense columns of figures, the shell company identifiers, and the specific routing digits listed for international wire transfers. My breath caught in my throat. I recognized the alphanumeric sequence immediately. It was the exact structural signature of a massive Cayman Islands Ponzi scheme I had personally flagged and submitted to federal regulators just months before my retirement. Julian Vance was not a wealth manager. He was a predator, operating a multi-million-dollar illusion, shifting new investor capital to pay out false returns to older clients. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. The absolute clinical nature of the transaction fueled a cold, calculating determination inside my chest. I realized that if Evan was involved in this, it might constitute elder financial abuse under California Welfare and Institutions Code, key paragraph 15.6.2030. If he had falsified any documents to force the equity line, it would be a clear violation of California Penal Code, Section 470 forgery, making the entire transaction void ab initio. I even considered invoking the prenuptial agreement infidelity clause, knowing how tightly Julian guarded his financial secrets. Julian Vance had proudly announced that Evan Garrison was now heavily invested in his fund. Evan Garrison was pumping his own money into a collapsing federal crime. But the peril extended far beyond Evan Garrison's foolishness. This house, the luxury property where they currently sat mocking me, was legally owned by a blind trust I had established a decade ago. I had structured it to protect the asset to protect, is allowing Evan Garrison to live here while shielding the equity from his reckless spending habits. If Evan Garrison was generating enough capital to buy into an exclusive offshore fund and support the maintenance of a luxury sports car, he was getting that liquidity from somewhere. I stepped out of the front door into the freezing night air. In the driveway, sitting under the glow of the security lights, was the sleek, aggressive shape of the new German sports car. Suddenly, the engine roared to life, a deafening blast of exhaust echoing through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Evan Garrison was revving the engine from inside, showing off his new prize to Chloe Garrison and Brenda, who stood cheering on the front porch. I stared at the vehicle, the pieces of the puzzle locking together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Evan Garrison did not have the liquid cash for this lifestyle. The only way he could access that kind of capital was by leveraging the house. He had found a way to bypass the blind trust. He had breached the defenses I built for him. I walked past the roaring sports car, ignoring Evan Garrison's arrogant gaze through the windshield. I climbed into my reliable 10-year-old sedan, started the engine, and pulled out of the neighborhood. The silent reckoning had begun. I knew precisely what I had to do, and I knew that by sunrise, the arrogant illusions they worshipped would begin to burn to the ground. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of wet asphalt and streetlights. I parked my old sedan in the designated spot of my modest gated complex. The contrast between Evan Garrison's sprawling manicured estate and my austere living situation was sharp, but it was entirely by design. I unlocked my door, bolted the heavy deadbolt, and stepped into the quiet dark. My home was stripped of unnecessary luxury. There was no extravagant art on the walls, no crystal chandeliers, only reinforced locks, a fireproof safe, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I did not bother turning on the living room lights. I did not collapse onto the sofa to weep over the cruel words my son had thrown at me. Tears were a useless currency in the face of imminent catastrophe. I walked straight into the spare bedroom I used as a home office. It contained nothing but a heavy steel desk and a custom-built encrypted workstation. 30 years of analyzing commercial fraud had hardwired my brain to respond to betrayal with absolute clinical precision. Paranoia is just another word for adequate preparation. I sat down in the leather chair, flipped the power switch, and waited for the dual monitors to cast a harsh white glow across my face. Sleep was out of the question. I poured a glass of cold water, drank it down, and placed my hands over the keyboard. I initiated the secure tunnel connection, routing my connection through a series of encrypted servers before accessing the main portal of the private wealth institution. Evan Garrison loved to brag about his real estate acumen. He loved standing on his expansive patio with a drink in his hand, telling his affluent neighbors how he outmaneuvered the housing market at 29 to secure that massive property. He paraded his success as proof of his own singular brilliance. He truly believed his sales commissions covered the staggering down payment and the suffocating monthly mortgage. He never bothered to look closely at the closing documents or the tax assessments. If he had stopped talking about himself for 5 minutes and actually read the paperwork, he would have noticed the name of the holding entity. He did not buy that house. I did. I set up a blind trust a decade ago to hold the deed. I did it because I saw him drowning in impulsive credit card debt long before Chloe Garrison ever entered the picture. I knew his desperate clawing need to impress people with flashy cars and designer clothes would eventually leave him bankrupt and homeless. So, I became his invisible safety net. I funneled the bulk of my retirement savings into that trust. I became his secret landlord, subsidizing his lavish lifestyle, artificially lowering his rental to look like a manageable mortgage, and protecting the equity from his own reckless pride. I traded my own comfort to ensure my son would never face ruin. Tonight, he looked me in the eye and called me a loser for it, but his insults were entirely irrelevant now. Personal pain had to be surgically removed from the equation. Evan Garrison had proudly announced he was heavily invested in Julian Vance's new offshore fund. That fund was a ghost ledger, a textbook Ponzi scheme destined for a devastating federal collapse. I had to know exactly how deep Evan Garrison had waded into the swamp. If he had simply handed Julian Vance a few thousand in cash, he was just a gullible victim. But I knew my son's finances intimately. Evan Garrison did not have liquid cash. He lived paycheck to paycheck, floating on a sea of revolving credit to maintain the illusion of absolute wealth. I bypassed the secondary firewall and logged directly into the core banking interface for the blind trust. The screen displayed the property details, a fortress of equity I had painstakingly guarded. I navigated to the liability column, my fingers moving with rigid mechanical speed. I was no longer a father processing a broken family. I was a commercial underwriter hunting down a fatal vulnerability. Julian Vance was not a man who dealt in small favors to buy a luxury imported sports car and secure a position in an elite offshore portfolio. Evan Garrison needed hundreds of thousands of dollars, money he absolutely did not possess. I stared at the loading icon on the screen, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. The digital ledger finally populated, filling the monitor with rows of transaction histories. I scanned the documents, my eyes darting across the dates and routing numbers. The house was supposed to be completely unencumbered. It was structured so that no debt could be attached to the property without the express authorized signature of the primary trustee, my signature. But as I scrolled down to the recent activity log, my breath caught in my throat. A massive gaping hole stared back at me from the screen. A newly minted home equity line of credit had been opened just 3 weeks prior. Authorized and entirely drained. Evan Garrison had bypassed the standard banking protocols. He had bypassed the safeguards. I leaned closer to the monitor, pulling up the digital copy of the authorization paperwork submitted to the lender. I scrolled to the bottom of the second page. Staring back at me was my own signature, perfectly replicated in blue ink. Evan Garrison had not just been ungrateful, he had not just been arrogant. My son had committed felony wire fraud and identity theft to drain $300,000 of my equity, handing it directly to a man operating a federal financial crime. The cold reality of the situation washed over the room. Evan Garrison had tied a concrete block to both of our ankles, and Julian Vance was about to push us off the ledge. The numbers glared back at me from the high-resolution monitor, painting a picture of financial sabotage so precise it took my breath away. For a decade, the blind trust that held the deed to the suburban estate had been an absolute fortress. I had structured it with ironclad parameters, specifically designing the legal framework, so that not a single cent of equity could be borrowed against the property without my explicit and notarized authorization. Evan Garrison was merely the beneficiary of my silent generosity. He was granted the right to reside in the home and play the part of a successful homeowner as long as he maintained the property taxes and handled the basic upkeep. The principal equity was supposed to remain entirely untouched. It was a secure asset shielded from his lifelong habit of living far beyond his actual means. But as my eyes tracked down the digital columns of the recent activity log, the illusion of security shattered completely. They recorded just 3 weeks prior was a catastrophic withdrawal. A home equity line of credit had been opened, approved, and entirely drained. $300, zero had been severed from the property and wired out in a single massive transaction. I leaned closer to the screen, feeling my heart hammer a slow and heavy rhythm against my ribs. I traced the routing number of the outgoing wire. It matched the offshore Cayman account from the prospectus I had seen on the credenza just hours ago. Evan Garrison had not simply handed his overblown sales commissions to his new stepfather. He had mortgaged the roof over his head, quietly extracting the lifeblood of the property to buy a seat at the table of a federal financial crime. I clicked the secure link to download the authorization paperwork the bank had kept on file. The document loaded line by line across my screen. I scrolled past the boilerplate terms and past the predatory interest rates Evan Garrison had blindly accepted straight to the final page, where the primary trustee was required to sign. I stopped breathing. Staring back at me from the bottom of the digital document was my own signature. It was not a clumsy imitation. It was a flawless forgery in dark blue ink, capturing the exact slant of my cursive and the sharp, distinctive loop of the first letter. It was a forgery so perfect that any standard bank clerk would process it without a second glance. I recognized the handiwork immediately. When Evan Garrison was a teenager, I had spent countless hours teaching him calligraphy. I was trying to instill a sense of patience and precision in a boy who always rushed recklessly through life. I had taught him how to hold the pen properly, how to gauge the pressure of the nib, and how to make the ink flow smoothly across the page. He had taken that exact lesson and weaponized it against me to steal $300,000 of my money. The sheer audacity of the betrayal radiated from the monitor. My son had sat across from me at dinner, mocking my practical clothes and calling me a loser. He had raised a glass of expensive wine, all while knowing he had committed felony wire fraud to fund the very lifestyle he was rubbing in my face. He felt invincible because he believed I was too old and too out of touch to ever audit the trust. However, the emotional sting of the betrayal evaporated almost instantly. It was quickly eclipsed by a far more dangerous reality. The analytical side of my brain, honed by decades of dismantling corporate fraud, immediately recognized the devastating chain reaction Evan Garrison had just ignited. Julian Vance was running a Ponzi scheme. The structure of his offshore fund was a house of cards waiting for a strong wind. Such schemes always collapse, and when they do, the implosion is violent and absolute. The federal authorities would trace every single dollar that flowed into the phantom accounts managed by Julian Vance. They would find the wire transfer originating from the home equity line of credit. The bank, realizing the collateral was tied to a massive criminal investigation, would immediately seize the suburban estate to recover their losses. And right there at the bottom of the fraudulent loan agreement was my signature. Because the blind trust was in my name, the federal investigators and the bank auditors would not see Evan Garrison as the mastermind. They would see me. They would see a retired commercial underwriter. They would see a man with the exact financial background necessary to engineer such a complex scheme, willfully borrowing against his own assets to fund an offshore criminal enterprise. By forging my name, Evan Garrison had not just stolen my money. He had legally bound me to the sinking ship. If I did not act before the authorities raided Julian Vance, I would be fully implicated in a federal conspiracy. They would freeze my legitimate retirement accounts. They would seize my apartment. They would drag me into a grueling legal nightmare that would consume the remaining years of my life. Evan Garrison had strapped a concrete block to both of our ankles, and Julian Vance was blindly walking us toward the edge of the cliff. The threat was no longer abstract. It was a ticking clock. Anjeet. I had to amputate the infected limb before the rot spread to my vital organs. I closed the document and opened a new secure window. I could not simply reverse the transaction. The money was already buried in a Cayman account and completely untouchable. Confronting Evan Garrison would only give him time to panic, deny everything, and potentially destroy the physical evidence of the forgery. I needed to move with absolute and overwhelming legal force. I needed to separate my identity from the blind trust and expose the fraud to the lender before the federal government realized the Ponzi scheme existed. I glanced at the digital clock in the corner of the monitor. It was 10 minutes 3 in the morning. A normal man would wait for business hours. A normal man would hesitate, paralyzed by the thought of destroying the life his own son had built. But I had spent 40 years learning how to survive the absolute worst-case scenario. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I kept securely memorized. I was about to unleash a financial avalanche that would crush the illusion Evan Garrison had built, and I would not lose a single moment of sleep doing it. The digital clock in the lower corner of my monitor shifted to 3 in the morning. The glow of the screen cast long, cold shadows across the bare walls of my office. I did not close the window displaying the forged signature. I left it open as a monument to my son's ultimate betrayal. I picked up my phone from the heavy steel desk and dialed a number I had committed to memory over 20 years ago. I listened to the line ring in the quiet darkness of the room. Once, twice. On the third ring, the line clicked open. And Gigi. William Thorne did not greet me. He was a corporate attorney who billed at $900 an hour, and he did not believe in wasting breath on pleasantries, even in the dead of night. He simply stated my name, his voice a low, grayly rasp that betrayed only a fraction of sleep. I told him to turn on his encrypted terminal. I told him we had a catastrophic breach that required an immediate response. I heard the rustle of heavy cotton sheets and the dull thud of his feet hitting the hardwood floor of his own home. Miles away, within 30 seconds, I heard the familiar mechanical clacking of his keyboard. William Thorne and I shared a specific language. It was a language built on risk assessment, liability vectors, and the absolute preservation of assets. I did not tell him about the disastrous dinner party. I did not tell him about Julian Vance or the cruel jokes Evan Garrison had made at my expense. I simply gave him the 9-digit identification number for the blind trust holding the deed to the suburban estate. I instructed William Thorne to access the recent liability logs. I waited in the silence of my apartment, listening to the rhythmic tapping of his keystrokes over the speaker. The tapping abruptly stopped. A heavy exhale filtered through the receiver. William Thorne had found the newly minted home equity line of credit. He had found the $300,000 extraction. He asked me quietly if I had authorized the transfer. I told him I had not. I explained that my signature had been flawlessly replicated, and the funds had been wired to an offshore holding account tied to an active federal criminal enterprise. William Thorne did not ask who forged the signature. He had drawn up the original paperwork for the trust himself. He knew exactly who lived in that house, and he knew exactly who was desperate and arrogant enough to leverage it. He did not offer useless sympathies. He simply asked me what my instructions were. I delivered the first command. I told him to draw up the emergency injunctions to dissolve the blind trust completely. The property was no longer a sanctuary. It was a live crime scene. By dissolving the trust, the legal shielding protecting the house would instantly evaporate. The estate would revert to a standard liquid asset status, entirely exposed to any incoming creditors. William Thorne warned me that doing so would strip Evan Garrison of his only legal residency. I told William Thorne to execute the paperwork without delay. I delivered the second command. I instructed him to draft a formal affidavit of forgery and submit it directly to the commercial lender, holding the new equity line. I told him to bypass the local branch managers and send the documents straight to their central fraud division. I knew exactly how commercial banks operated in these scenarios. The moment their fraud division received a sworn affidavit from the primary trustee denying authorization, they would panic. They would instantly flag the entire loan as a high-risk fraudulent liability. They would demand the immediate return of the $300,000. When Evan Garrison inevitably failed to produce the stolen cash, they would initiate a rapid foreclosure protocol to seize the collateral. The house would be locked down and confiscated. William Thorne typed furiously. The sound of his keystrokes filled the quiet space of my office. He stopped typing and took a slow, measured breath. He reminded me that Evan Garrison was my only son. He warned me that initiating a formal fraud investigation with the lender would not just take the house away. It would likely trigger a direct criminal referral. The bank would ruthlessly pursue Evan Garrison for wire fraud and identity theft. I stared at the forged signature glowing on my monitor. I reminded William Thorne that Evan Garrison had not hesitated to forge my name and bind me to a massive Ponzi scheme. He had gladly pushed me onto the tracks. I was simply stepping out of the way of the train. I delivered the third and final command. I told William Thorne to access the joint corporate operating accounts. 5 years ago, when Evan Garrison decided he wanted to play the role of an independent sales contractor, I had provided the seed money. I set up a joint business account to give him a pristine credit foundation. I provided the capital backing, ensuring his operational expenses were covered while he built his client list. Evan Garrison used that specific account to float his daily existence. He used it to pay for his designer suits, his lavish dinners, and the exorbitant maintenance of his shallow lifestyle. It was the sole oxygen supply to his illusion of wealth. I told William Thorne to freeze it entirely. I told him to initiate a total legal lock on the corporate accounts and to withdraw my original principal investment down to the last remaining cent. William Thorne's voice dropped to a somber whisper. He explained the mathematical cascade effect of what I was ordering him to do. He told me that modern financial algorithms are ruthless and deeply interconnected. The moment I froze the joint account and withdrew the capital, Evan Garrison's automated payments would begin to violently bounce. His credit cards would trigger automated default algorithms. The auto dealership financing his brand new sports car would receive a red flag notification on his income verification. The digital banking systems would automatically cross-reference the severe fraud alert placed on the mortgage. Within 72 hours, Evan Garrison would be completely locked out of the global financial system. He would have zero liquidity. He would have absolutely no credit. He would have no home. William Thorne told me this was not just a protective legal maneuver. It was a total financial execution. He asked me one final time if I was absolutely certain I wanted to push the button. I looked away from this monitor. I looked at the dark, empty walls of my quiet apartment. I thought about the decades I spent breathing in toxic chemical dust, working double shifts just to keep my son alive. I thought about the vintage watch sitting abandoned and discarded on the mahogany dining table. I did not feel any lingering anger. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the cold, profound clarity of a balanced ledger. I spoke into the receiver with absolute certainty. Execute it. I hung up the phone. The line went dead and the silence in my office felt heavier than before. William Thorne was already moving, mobilizing his firm to dismantle the blind trust and freeze the corporate accounts. But my work for the night was not yet finished. The trust and the business account were the major arteries, but Evan Garrison was kept alive by a network of smaller, invisible veins. I turned back to my dual monitors, the harsh light illuminating the dark circles under my eyes. I had spent a decade building a comprehensive financial safety net to protect my son from his own catastrophic lack of judgment. It was time to tear it down. I opened my personal password vault. I navigated to the portal for the auto insurance conglomerate. Evan Garrison drove that new imported sports car, but the insurance policy that allowed him to legally drive it off the lot was anchored by my pristine credit score. When he was 22, he had wrapped his first car around a telephone pole. He was uninsured and facing ruin. I paid the damages out of my own pocket and co-signed his next policy. I never took my name off the account. I just kept paying the premium differences to keep his rates artificially low. I logged into the system, found the active policy for his vehicles, and selected the option to remove the guarantor. The screen prompted a warning stating that removing my backing would trigger an immediate audit of the primary driver's risk profile. I clicked confirm. The policy updated. The safety net was gone. By morning, the insurance company would recalculate his premium based solely on his actual debt-to-income ratio. They would demand a massive upfront payment he could not afford or cancel his coverage outright. I did not pause to process the gravity of the action. The underwriter inside me had completely taken over, working with absolute emotional detachment. I moved to the next tab, the Platinum credit lines. Evan Garrison loved to flash those heavy metal cards at expensive restaurants. He loved the difference it bought him from waiters and valets. He genuinely believed his sales job qualified him for elite credit tiers. He never knew that those accounts were tied to an umbrella policy I maintained through my former firm. I was the silent guarantor, standing behind every overpriced steak and luxury vacation he charged. I accessed the banking portal for the credit issuer. I navigated to the guarantor authorization page. A simple digital form stood between Evan Garrison and total insolvini. I thought about Chloe Garrison laughing at the vintage watch. I thought about the sheer disdain in her voice as she mocked something built with patience and care. I typed in my authorization codes and revoked my backing on all 4 of his premium credit lines. The system processed the request. I watched the status indicators change from active to suspended, pending primary user income verification. The algorithms would automatically sweep his independent financials within 24 hours. They would find the massive fraudulent liability. William Thorne was reporting to the mortgage lender. They would immediately restrict his purchasing power to 0. The metal cards in his wallet were now nothing more than useless pieces of plastic. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a steady mechanical rhythm. I logged into the portal for the comprehensive lifestyle umbrella policy. This was the most crucial layer of protection. It shielded his personal assets from civil liability if someone slipped on his marble patio, or if he caused a major accident in his sports car. This policy ensured he would not lose everything in a lawsuit. I had set it up the day he bought his first luxury watch, wanting to ensure his superficial treasures did not make him a target. It was $1 million shield built on my sweat and my sleepless nights at the chemical plant. I stared at the cancellation button. This was the final chord. Once I severed this, Evan Garrison would be completely exposed to the unforgiving reality of the world he thought he had conquered. He would be entirely dependent on Julian Vance and the fraudulent offshore fund he had illegally bought into. I remembered the exact tone of his voice when he called me a loser in front of a table full of people. I remembered the smug, triumphant look on my ex-wife's face. They worshipped the illusion of winning without understanding the mechanics of risk. I clicked the button. The screen flashed a confirmation message. The umbrella policy was terminated effective immediately. I pushed my chair back from the desk. The digital ledgers were closed. The protective barriers were dismantled. Over the course of a single hour, I had systematically eradicated every financial advantage I had secretly provided for my son. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the quiet, dark parking lot of my apartment complex. A cold rain had begun to fall, slicking the pavement and washing the dust from the hoods of the modest cars parked below. The gears were in motion. William Thorne was locking down the corporate accounts and alerting the mortgage lender of the felony fraud. The credit issuers and insurance conglomerates were algorithms waking up to process the sudden evaporation of Evan Garrison's guarantor. By the time the sun came up, the automated systems governing modern wealth would begin their ruthless work. Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison would wake up in their luxury bed, completely unaware that the financial ground beneath them had turned to ash. I turned off the monitors, plunging the office into total darkness. I walked to my bedroom, laid down on the mattress, and closed my eyes. I did not dream. I simply waited for the inevitable crash. 4 days passed in absolute silence. I did not call Evan Garrison, and he did not call me. He was too busy basking in the hollow glory of his new acquisition. By Saturday afternoon, the suburban air was thick with the smell of expensive charred meat and the low hum of curated jazz. Evan Garrison was hosting a lavish backyard barbecue. I sat parked 3 blocks away in my 10-year-old sedan, the engine cut, listening to the quiet ticking of my dashboard clock. I did not need to be inside the gates to see the performance. I knew the choreography by heart. Evan Garrison would be standing by the pristine outdoor kitchen, holding a craft beer, telling his affluent neighbors about the aggressive moves he was making in the market. He would gesture casually toward the driveway, where the brand-new imported sports car sat gleaming in the sun, angled perfectly for maximum visibility. It was his ultimate trophy, a heavy metal crown, proving he had finally conquered the real world. But gravity is a ruthless force, and I had already severed the cables holding him suspended. At exactly 2 in this afternoon, the soft jazz and clinking glasses were violently swallowed by the harsh, grinding roar of a heavy diesel engine. A massive, scarred flatbed tow truck swung wide off the manicured street and reversed aggressively into the driveway. The hydraulic brakes hissed like a striking snake. The truck blocked the exit, completely casting a long, dark shadow over the immaculate paving stones. I watched through my binoculars as the crowd of neighbors froze. The laughter died instantly. Evan Garrison stepped out from the backyard, a pair of silver grilling tongs still in his hand. His face was flushed with wine and irritation. He walked toward the truck with the exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he owned the ground beneath his feet. He shouted at the driver, waving his hand dismissively, assuming it was a lost laborer who had taken a wrong turn into the wrong zip code. He demanded the truck be moved immediately. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in a stained reflective vest, did not apologize. He did not ask for directions. He stepped down from the high cab holding a thick metal clipboard and a length of heavy steel chain. He ignored Evan Garrison entirely, walking straight to the front of the gleaming sports car to check the vehicle identification number stamped just inside the windshield. Evan Garrison closed the distance, his voice rising from irritation to outright anger. He pointed a finger at the driver's chest, demanding to know what he was doing, touching a $100,000 machine. The driver simply checked a box on his clipboard and shoved a crumpled pink carbon copy sheet directly against Evan Garrison's chest. The automated financial systems had executed my commands with flawless brutality. The moment I removed my name as the guarantor from the auto insurance policy, the conglomerate instantly flagged the account. The system automatically queried the primary driver's risk profile. Without the artificial shield of my pristine credit score, the algorithm stared directly at Evan Garrison's actual financial reality. It saw the suffocating credit card debt, the zero balance savings, and the immediate terrifying risk of a buyer who could not legally afford the rubber on the tires. The insurance was canceled instantly. The auto dealership received an automated alert that their unverified buyer was now driving an uninsured 6F-figure asset. The financing fell through the floor in a matter of seconds. The dealership did not call to politely negotiate. They dispatched the recovery team to reclaim their property. Chloe Garrison rushed out the front door, her designer heels clicking frantically against the pavement. She grabbed Evan Garrison's arm, her voice shrill and panicked, demanding to know why a garbage truck was parked in their driveway. Evan Garrison stared at the pink sheet of paper, his face draining of all color. The arrogant sneer melted away, replaced by the cold, vacant shock of a man stepping on a landmine. The mechanical whine of the industrial winch shattered the suburban silence. The heavy steel chains rattled as the driver dragged them across the concrete, hooking them ruthlessly onto the pristine undercarriage of the sports car. Evan Garrison dropped his grilling tongs. They clattered loudly against the pavement. He lunged forward, grabbing the driver's reflective vest, pleading and stammering. He pulled out his phone, screaming that it was a simple clerical error. that his father-in-law was a wealth manager and that he could buy the car twice over in cash. The repo man did not care about Julian Vance or the offshore accounts. He operated in the tangible world of authorized ledgers and verified collateral. He shoved Evan Garrison back, effortlessly activated the hydraulic lever, and the winch screamed as it hauled the luxury vehicle up the steep steel ramp of the flatbed. The car's alarm began to blare a desperate rhythmic wailing that echoed through the entire neighborhood. The affluent guests holding their craft beers and expensive wine stood frozen on the lawn. They watched in absolute silence as the undeniable realities of a repossession dragged Evan Garrison's illusion of success away. No one offered to help. No one looked away. They simply stared, absorbing the toxic humiliation radiating from the driveway. Chloe Garrison covered her face with her hands, sobbing as the tow truck secured the load and shifted into gear. The heavy diesel engine roared again, pulling out of the driveway and leaving behind a stark, empty rectangle of concrete stained with a few drops of black oil. Evan Garrison stood completely alone in the center of the driveway, his phone clutched in his shaking hand. The crown had been ripped from his head in front of the very audience he had bled himself dry to impress. He stared blankly at the empty space where his validation had been parked just moments before. I watched his thumb frantically swiping across the screen of his phone. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was logging into the joint corporate business account. He was desperately trying to access the liquid cash to chase the tow truck down and buy his pride back before the party dispersed. He was rushing blindly into the second phase of the collapse, completely unaware that the vault he was trying to open had already been emptied. The heavy diesel engine of the tow truck roared, sending a thick cloud of dark exhaust billowing over the manicured lawns of the neighborhood. The industrial winch groaned as it locked the imported sports car securely onto the steel ramp of the flatbed. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan parked 3 blocks away, observing the chaotic scene through a pair of compact binoculars. I watched the crowd of affluent guests stand frozen on the grass, holding their expensive craft beers and plates of catered food. They were completely paralyzed by the sudden violent intrusion of reality into their curated suburban bubble. I focused the lenses on Evan Garrison. He was standing in the center of the driveway, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. He had dropped his silver grilling tongs onto the pavement. His pristine designer shirt was damp with nervous sweat. He was no longer the arrogant prince holding court at the head of a dining table. He was a desperate man watching his ultimate status symbol, being dragged away in front of the very people he had bled his own finances dry to impress. Anjit, Chloe Garrison, was standing near the porch, clutching her face and sobbing loudly, demanding that Evan Garrison do something to stop the humiliation. I knew exactly what Evan Garrison was about to do. He operated under the absolute delusion that every problem in the world could be solved by throwing cash at it. He reached into his pocket with trembling hands and pulled out his smartphone. He was going to access the joint corporate business account. 5 years ago, when he decided he wanted to launch an independent sales consulting firm, I had provided the foundational seed money. I established a joint corporate account with a massive initial capital injection to give him a pristine credit baseline. He used that specific account as his personal lifeline. It was the reservoir he tapped to pay for his tailored suits, his extravagant vacations, and the daily maintenance of his shallow existence. Through the binoculars, I watched Evan Garrison frantically swiping his thumb across the glass screen. His facial recognition failed because he was sweating profusely and his hands were shaking. He typed in his security passcode with desperate, forceful jabs. He was fully prepared to transfer $50,000 directly to the tow truck driver. He intended to pay whatever extortionate fee was required to unhook the vehicle and save his reputation in front of his wealthy neighbors. He opened the banking application, expecting to see the reassuring solid 6-figure balance of the corporate operating fund. I did not need to see the screen of his phone to know exactly what the application was displaying. I knew the interface by heart because I had logged into the same system 3 nights ago. Evan Garrison was staring at a stark white screen dominated by a bright red warning circle. The available balance was $0. Directly beneath that empty sum was a rapidly expanding list of pending transactions, showing multiple overdraft fees accumulating in real time as his automated lifestyle subscriptions tried and failed to draw funds. I watched the color drain completely from his face. The aggressive swagger evaporated, leaving behind a pale mask of sheer terror. He tapped the screen repeatedly, convinced it was a digital glitch. He closed the application and forced it to reopen. He stood in the driveway, muttering to himself, utterly incapable of processing the mathematical reality in front of him. He looked up at the tow truck driver and ran toward the cab of the truck, holding his phone out like a shield. I could read his frantic body language. He was pleading with the driver. He was promising that the banking servers were temporarily down and offering to pay double the repossession fee in cash if the man would just wait 10 minutes for the system to reset. The driver did not look at the phone. He operated in the physical collateral. He rolled up his window, engaged the heavy transmission, and the truck pulled out of the driveway, dragging the luxury sports car down the street and out of sight. Evan Garrison did not chase the truck. His legs seemed glued to the concrete. He stared back down at his phone, scrolling wildly through the transaction ledger, looking for the error. He was searching for the missing funds. He scrolled down to the activity log from 3 days prior. I knew the exact moment his eyes found the entry. It was a single massive outward wire transfer that emptied the vault. The transaction description consisted of 4 simple words: primary trustee principal withdrawal. Evan Garrison stopped breathing. I saw his shoulders slump as the devastating truth crashed over him. He understood the legal designation of a primary trustee. He knew exactly who held that title. It was not a banking error. It was I had legally recalled every single dollar of my original investment. Because the account was structured as a joint venture, with my capital acting as the foundation, I possessed the absolute legal authority to withdraw my backing at any moment without providing him with prior notification. The implications of that zero balance began to suffocate him. Without that operating account, he had absolutely no liquidity. He could not pay his independent contractors. He could not satisfy his aggressive vendors. He could not cover the exorbitant minimum payments on the platinum credit cards he had used to purchase the expensive meats and imported wines currently being consumed in his backyard. He was standing in the middle of his driveway, completely financially naked. Chloe Garrison ran across the concrete and grabbed his arm, shaking him violently. She was screaming, demanding to know why he had let the truck leave. She demanded to know why he did not just transfer the money. Evan Garrison looked at his wife slowly. The man who had mocked my vintage watch was now entirely stripped of his power. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He simply turned the screen of his phone toward her, allowing her to see the bright red 0. Chloe Garrison stepped back as if she had been physically struck. The illusion of their shared prosperity shattered instantly. The neighbors, sensing the absolute finality of the disaster, began to quietly gather their coats and whisper among themselves. They abandoned their plates of food and moved swiftly toward the gates, averting their eyes to distance themselves from the sudden stench of ruin. Evan Garrison dropped his arms to his sides. The panic in his eyes began to harden into a volatile, desperate rage. He realized the depth of my orchestration. He knew I had pulled the insurance to trigger the repossession. He knew I had emptied the account to trap him. His arrogance convinced him that he could bully me into reversing the damage. He ignored his sobbing wife, turned his back on the fleeing guests, and marched toward his cheap rental car. The conflict had chained perfectly into the next sequence. He was coming to my apartment to demand his life back, completely unaware that the trap had only just begun to snap shut. The rain that began hours ago had settled into a steady, relentless downpour against the single window of my living room. I sat in my worn leather armchair facing the heavy solid wood of my front door. The apartment was completely dark, save for the amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the wet glass. I did not turn on a single lamp. I did not brew a cup of coffee or pace the floor. I simply sat in the deep quiet of the room and waited for the inevitable arrival of the storm I had engineered. I knew my son better than he knew himself. I knew that once the initial shock of the public repossession faded and the paralyzing reality of the empty bank accounts set in his panic would quickly mutate into a blind, furious rage. He would not stop to analyze his own catastrophic mistakes or the felony he had committed. He would seek a target to absorb the blame. I heard the vehicle long before I saw it. It was not the low, aggressive growl of a finely tuned imported engine. It was the high-pitched, strained whine of a cheap four-cylinder rental car struggling against the steep incline of my street. The brakes squealed sharply as the car jerked into the visitor parking space directly below my window. A car door slammed shut with a hollow metallic thud that echoed through the wet night air. I closed my eyes and listened to the heavy, rapid rhythm of footsteps splashing through the puddles on the pavement. The footsteps did not pause at the security gate. They pounded furiously up the exterior concrete stairs, taking them two at a time. The frantic energy of the approach broadcast his desperation to the entire building. The first blow against my front door was a massive concussive strike that rattled the picture frames on the adjacent wall. It was not a knock. It was the impact of a closed fist driven by absolute panic. Evan Garrison began to pound on the heavy wood with a violent, unrelenting rhythm. He shouted my name, his voice completely devoid of the slick, polished arrogance he had weaponized at the dinner party. It was raw and cracking, tearing through the quiet hallway of my building. He screamed that he knew exactly what I had done. He demanded that I open the door immediately and face him. I remained perfectly still in my leather armchair. I did not shift my weight or make a single sound. I let his anger crash against the physical barrier between us. He struck the door again and again, kicking the baseboard with the heavy heel of his designer shoe. He accused me of malicious sabotage. He yelled that I had intentionally humiliated him in front of his friends and business associates. He shouted that the repo men had dragged his car away while his neighbors watched, and that it was entirely my fault. He demanded that I transfer the $300,000 back into the joint operating account right this second. He screamed that I had no right to touch that money because he had earned it through his own hard work. The sheer delusion of his statements hung in the cold air of my apartment. He had convinced himself that the capital I provided from decades of back-breaking labor somehow belonged to him by divine right. I listened to the escalating desperation in his voice. I did not feel the urge to stand up and engage in a bitter, screaming match. I did not want to argue about the forged signature on the blind trust or the federal criminal investigation he had blindly funded. Engaging with him would only validate his delusion. It would give him a tangible enemy to fight. A screaming match would provide him with the emotional release he was desperately seeking. I chose to deny him that comfort. I chose to offer him nothing but an absolute impenetrable silence. The silence was not a passive retreat. It was the most devastating weapon I possessed. It reflected his own massive failures right back into his face. His voice grew louder and more frantic as the lack of response began to unnerve him. He threatened to call his lawyers. He threatened to have me arrested for financial interference. He threw every empty threat he could muster against the solid wood door, hoping to provoke a reaction. He screamed that I was jealous of his success and that I was a bitter old man trying to destroy his future. I sat in the darkness and let the venom wash over me. None of his words carried any weight. They were the desperate thrashings of a drowning man who had just realized the lifeboat was an illusion. After 20 minutes, the violent pounding began to slow. The physical exertion of his rage was draining his reserves. His strikes against the door turned into heavy rhythmic thuds as he leaned his weight against the wood. The anger in his voice slowly bled away, replaced by the cold, creeping panic of genuine realization. He stopped screaming and began to plead. His voice dropped to a hoarse, desperate whisper that seeped through the gap beneath the door. He begged me to just open the door and talk to him. He said he was ruined. He said Chloe Garrison was threatening to leave him and that Julian Vance was ignoring his calls. He admitted that his credit was completely frozen and he had absolutely no way to pay for his life. He pleaded for a second chance, promising that he would make it right if I just turned the financial accounts back on. I stared at the shadow of the door in the dim light. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle on the cracked pavement of our old driveway. I remembered the endless overtime shifts I worked to pay for his college tuition, so he would never have to breathe the toxic dust of a chemical plant. I had given him every advantage a father could possibly provide, and he had repaid that devotion by forging my name to fund a criminal enterprise. My silence was the final lesson I had left to teach him. I would not rescue him from the consequences of his own arrogance. I would not absorb the impact of his fall. The pleading eventually stopped. A long, profound quiet settled over the hallway. I heard a heavy, ragged sigh filter through the wood. The realization had finally broken him. He understood that the door was never going to open. He understood that the limitless well of my silent generosity had completely run dry. I listened as he slowly pushed himself away from the door. His footsteps were heavy and dragging as he walked back down the concrete stairs. There was no furious sprint to the car. There was only the slow, defeated march of a man walking into a reality he could no longer escape. I heard the high-pitched whine of the rental car engine turn over. The headlights swept across my living room ceiling as the vehicle slowly pulled out of the parking space and rolled down the hill, dissolving into the rainy night. I remained seated in my leather armchair for a long time. The apartment was completely silent again. The confrontation was over, and the severed cords could never be tied back together. The heavy wood of the front door shuddered under one final violent impact. Evan Garrison kicked the baseboard with the last remaining reserve of his adrenaline. The dull thud echoed down the empty hallway outside and vibrated through the floorboards beneath my leather armchair. I sat perfectly still in the dark. I listened to his ragged, wet breathing on the other side of the threshold. He was panting heavily, exhausted by his own futile rage. He had spent the last half hour throwing every accusation and empty threat against a wall of absolute silence. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for me to open the door and offer him the argument he desperately needed to validate his victimhood. I denied him that comfort. I simply waited for the exact moment his physical energy burned out, leaving him completely hollow. When his breathing finally slowed and the silence stretched into a long, heavy pause, I moved. I stood up from the armchair, my footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet. I walked to the small table near the entryway. Resting on the polished surface was a thick manila envelope. William Thorne had sent the documents via secure courier hours ago. Anticipating this exact confrontation, the paperwork inside was crisp and heavy, carrying the absolute weight of federal banking regulations. I picked up the envelope, feeling the sharp edges of the paper. I did not unlock the deadbolt. I did not turn the brass handle. I simply knelt on the floor and pushed the thick package through the narrow gap beneath the door. The heavy paper scraped against the hardwood floor with a harsh, dry sound. The noise cut through the quiet tension of the hallway. On the other side of the door, Evan Garrison suddenly stopped breathing. I heard the rustle of the expensive suit jacket he wore. As he knelt down, I heard his fingers scrambling against the floorboards to grasp the paper. He pulled the envelope through the gap. He did not ask what it was. He did not demand an explanation. He simply tore the heavy paper open. The sound of the envelope ripping was loud and violent in the quiet night. I stood up and crossed my arms, waiting for the reality of the documents to infiltrate his mind. The first page he pulled out was the formal notice of immediate foreclosure. It was not a standard warning letter for a missed payment. It was a catastrophic legal demand generated by the Central Fraud Division of the commercial lender. When William Thorne submitted the sworn affidavit of forgery, denying my authorization for the home equity line of credit, the bank moved with ruthless speed. Commercial lenders do not hesitate when they detect felony wire fraud on a 6F figurer loan. They instantly activated the acceleration clause buried deep within the fine print of the fraudulent contract Evan Garrison had blindly signed. The acceleration clause demanded the immediate and total repayment of the bank, required a certified wire transfer by the close of the next business day. Evan Garrison had already funneled every single cent of that money into an untouchable offshore holding account controlled by his criminal stepfather. He could not recover the cash. He could not pay the bank. The second page outlined the consequences of his inevitable default. Because I had successfully dissolved the suburban estate, the property was no longer legally shielded. It was no longer a protected sanctuary. hiding behind my pristine financial history. It had reverted to an exposed liquid asset tied directly to a fraudulent loan. The bank, recognizing the severe criminal liability, had immediately seized the collateral. The document stated in stark, undeniable legal terms that the property was now under the total control of the lending institution. Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison were no longer the proud residents of an affluent suburban neighborhood. They were illegal trespassers, living inside an asset owned entirely by the bank. The final paragraph of the document delivered the absolute crushing blow. The lender did not offer a 30-day grace period. They did not offer a window for negotiation or legal appeals. Because the loan was flagged for active felony fraud, the bank secured an emergency eviction mandate. The document clearly stated that all occupants had exactly 72 hours to permanently vacate the premises. If they remained inside the house past the deadline, local law enforcement would arrive to physically remove them and confiscate all remaining personal property left inside the structures. I listened to the silence in the hallway. I could hear the dry rustle of the pages shaking in his hands. Evan Garrison began to read the words out loud, his voice a weak, trembling whisper. He read the total amount demanded by the bank. He read the 72-hour eviction mandate. He stumbled over the legal terminology, his mind completely unable to process the absolute destruction of his curated life. He had arrived at my door furious about a repossessed sports car. He was now holding the undeniable proof that he had lost his entire world. He had no house. He had no credit. He had no cash. He had 72 hours to pack his designer clothes into garbage bags and find a place to sleep. He could not turn to his affluent neighbors for shelter. The people who had stood on his manicured lawn and watched the tow truck drag his prized vehicle away would never answer his phone calls again. They smelled the undeniable stench of financial ruin, and they would lock their doors against him. He could not turn to Chloe Garrison. Her loyalty was entirely conditional, based completely on the illusion of wealth he had projected. When she realized the massive luxury estate was gone and the designer furniture would be seized by the bank, she would abandon him instantly. He could not turn to Julian Vance. The offshore accounts were a black hole designed to swallow stolen money and disappear. Julian Vance would burn his own phone before he ever answered a call from a stepson tied to an active banking fraud investigation. Evan Garrison was entirely isolated. He could not hire a defense attorney to fight the eviction because his bank accounts were completely frozen. He could not secure a lease on a cheap apartment because his credit score was entirely anchored to the fraudulent mortgage default. He was completely trapped by the mechanics of his own greed. He had forged my signature, assuming I would simply absorb the damage to protect him. He never considered that I would sever the infected limb to save myself. He did not hit the door again. He did not scream or demand his money back. The fight had been entirely drained from his body. I heard the pages slip from his hands and scatter across the floor. I heard a low, guttural sob build in his chest and escape his throat. It was the sound of total unmitigated defeat. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor. His footsteps were heavy and dragging as he walked away from my apartment. He moved down the hallway with the slow, clumsy gait of a man who had just realized he was completely alone in the world. I listened as the heavy fire door at the end of the hall opened and closed, sealing his fate. I remained standing in the dark apartment, the silence finally absolute and unbroken. I had given him 72 hours to vanish, and I knew he would not waste a single second. The digital clock on my desk glowed in the dark room. The silence of the apartment was broken only by the steady rhythm of the rain against the glass. The 72 hours had expired. I knew exactly where Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison had gone because there was only one place left that would take them in. They had retreated to the glass and steel fortress overlooking the city's skyline. They were dragging their heavy designer luggage across the pristine marble floors of the luxury penthouse owned by his mother and his wealthy stepfather. I pictured the scene with absolute clarity. Evan Garrison sweating in a wrinkled shirt, avoiding the judgmental gaze of the lobby concierge. Chloe Garrison holding her expensive leather handbag like a shield, her face stained with tears and exhaustion. They were no longer the vibrant, successful couple hosting lavish barbecues. They were financial refugees seeking asylum in a monument to arrogant wealth. They had to swallow their pride and beg for shelter under Julian Vance and Brenda's roof. The red light on my answering machine began to blink. It flashed with an angry, urgent rhythm, piercing the quiet gloom of my office. I did not move from my leather armchair. I simply reached out and pressed the button. The mechanical click of the machine was immediately followed by a voice I had not heard in years. It was Brenda. Her tone was sharp and venomous, dripping with the same condescending poison that had suffocated our marriage. She did not ask for an explanation. She did not express confusion over why her son had been violently evicted from his home. She immediately went on the offensive. She called my actions pathetic and petty. She screamed into the receiver that I was a bitter old man trying to destroy my own flesh and blood out of sheer jealousy. Her voice echoed off the bare walls of my apartment, filling the space with a toxic, frantic energy. I listened without a single flicker of emotion. Her furious tirade seamlessly shifted from the present crisis to the deep resentments of our past. She threw our divorce in my face, wielding history like a blunt weapon. 15 years ago, she had sat across from me in a cold, sterile mediator's office and surgically extracted exactly half of everything I had built. I had spent decades working exhausting double shifts at the chemical plant, saving every penny to secure our future. She took it all without a second of hesitation. Through the crackling speaker, Brenda reminded me exactly why she had left. She told me my lack of ambition was a clear's throat disease. She despised my quiet, steady approach to life. She hated my practical clothes and my reliable car. She wanted the loud, flashy illusion of success, and she left me to find it. She told me then that I would die a poor, invisible loser while she moved on to bigger and better things. Now, 15 years later, she was using my son's financial collapse to prove her point all over again. I remained perfectly still, letting the answering machine record every single syllable. Brenda took a deep breath, letting her anger solidify into a cold, triumphant boast. She told me that my little stunt with the bank and the auto dealership meant absolutely nothing. She proudly declared that she and Julian Vance were stepping in to fix the mess I had created. She wanted me to know that my attempt to ruin Evan Garrison had completely failed because Julian Vance was a real man with real power. Her voice rose to a gloating crescendo. She announced that Julian Vance was not going to let his stepson live like a peasant. She explicitly stated that Julian Vance was preparing to tap into his offshore capital reserves. He was going to use those specific international funds to purchase a brand new estate for Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison. She promised it would be twice the size of the house I had just taken from them. She framed it as the ultimate revenge, a massive display of wealth designed specifically to humiliate me and highlight my pathetic lack of vision. She laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that distorted through the speaker. She told me to enjoy my miserable, lonely life in my tiny apartment, while my son thrived in the world of high finance. She promised that Evan Garrison would never speak to me again and that I had permanently erased myself from his future. The line clicked and went dead, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. I sat in the dark and looked at the blinking red light. Brenda believed she had just delivered a fatal emotional blow. She believed her venomous voicemail had put me in my place and secured her triumphant victory. She was completely blinded by her own arrogance. She did not realize the catastrophic mistake she had just made. She did not understand the intricate web of liability that was slowly closing around her new husband. By leaving that specific message, Brenda had just handed me the final devastating piece of evidence I needed. She had proudly and voluntarily recorded a verbal confession. She explicitly linked Julian Vance to the offshore capital and openly declared his immediate intent to use those funds for a massive domestic real estate purchase. I knew those offshore accounts were the repository for the stolen money from the fraudulent Ponzi scheme. Brenda had just officially documented an active conspiracy to launder federal criminal proceeds through a luxury property transaction. I leaned forward and pressed a button on the machine, saving the digital audio file directly to my encrypted hard drive. The trap had been set, and Brenda had just gladly tied the rope around her own neck. Julian Vance was already sitting on top of a crumbling financial scheme, and now his own wife had provided the authorities with a detailed map of where the stolen money was hiding. I did not feel angry or insulted by her words. I felt a profound cold satisfaction. I backed up the file to a secure secondary server, shut down the monitor, and walked into the kitchen to make a fresh pot of coffee. The indame had officially begun, and I was ready to watch their glass tower shatter. The red light on my answering machine stopped blinking. I pressed the save button and locked the digital audio file deep inside my encrypted server. Brenda had just handed me the exact rope she and Julian Vance would hang from. She had proudly confessed his intention to use offshore capital to buy domestic real estate. It was a flawless admission of money laundering recorded in her own arrogant voice. I sat back in my leather armchair and listened to the rain beating against the glass. I knew Julian Vance perfectly well, even without ever spending significant time in his presence. He was a man driven entirely by his fragile ego and his desperate need to project absolute dominance over everyone around him. Brenda had made a venomous promise to Evan Garrison, and Julian Vance was now legally and morally obligated to fulfill it. He had to play the wealthy savior to maintain the illusion he had constructed. Julian Vance had spent years carefully building his phantom investment fund. He kept the stolen money buried deep in the Cayman Islands, safely outside the immediate jurisdiction of standard federal regulators. Normally, a man operating a scheme of that magnitude would move his money slowly and with extreme caution. He would filter it through dummy corporations and anonymous shell companies, washing every single dollar carefully before ever bringing it back onto domestic soil. But Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison were currently sitting in his luxury penthouse, demanding immediate salvation. Brenda was whispering in his ear, demanding that he crushed my spirit by purchasing a massive estate for her son. Julian Vance simply did not have the time to be careful. He was blinded by his own hubris and the pressing, urgent need to perform for his new family. Miles away in his glass tower, Julian Vance opened his secure laptop. I could easily picture him sitting in his lavish study, pouring a glass of expensive bourbon. He likely scoffed at my name while he logged into his offshore financial portal. He deliberately bypassed all his carefully constructed safety protocols. He needed a vast amount of liquid cash instantly to buy a high-end property outright and secure Evan Garrison a brand new throne. He selected his primary Cayman holding account. He typed in a transfer request for $2 million. He routed the money directly from the Caribbean into a standard domestic escrow account located in our city. He clicked confirm, believing he was completely untouchable. He believed he was the undisputed master of the board, making a brilliant tactical strike to permanently humiliate a retired underwriter. Julian Vance did not realize that the board had already been rigged from the very beginning. He did not know that his stepson had foolishly forged my signature on a commercial loan document just weeks prior. He did not know that I had already submitted a sworn affidavit of forgery to the commercial lender, triggering a massive internal audit. When William Thorne and I reported that specific fraudulent loan, we intentionally illuminated the destination of the stolen funds. We had drawn a bright red circle around Julian Vance and his offshore accounts. We had handed the federal banking regulators a highly detailed map and a magnifying glass. The Central Fraud Division had quietly placed a severe surveillance monitor on every single financial entity connected to Julian Vance. They were waiting in the dark, silently watching his digital footprints and waiting for him to make a critical error. The moment Julian Vance clicked confirm on his laptop, the global banking algorithms woke up. $2 million surged out of the Cayman Islands, attempting to cross the domestic border in a single unverified leap. The massive transaction slammed directly into the invisible tripwire I had meticulously laid down. An automated red flag triggered deep inside the federal banking servers. The system immediately recognized the incoming capital. It matched the international routing numbers perfectly to the offshore accounts currently tied to the pending wire fraud investigation, involving my forged signature. The transaction did not clear the security checkpoints. It was instantly frozen mid-flight by the authorities, locking the funds in a digital purgatory. The federal monitors did not simply stop the wire transfer and issue a warning. The sudden aggressive movement of illicit offshore capital triggered an automatic escalation protocol across multiple government agencies. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network received an instant high-priority notification. The algorithm connected the scattered data points with ruthless and terrifying efficiency. It linked the initial stolen $300,000 from Evan Garrison's home equity line directly to Julian Vance and his $2 million domestic transfer. The system recognized the classic indisputable signature of a massive Ponzi scheme desperately attempting to launder its illicit funds on American soil. Julian Vance had tried to use his stolen wealth as a blunt weapon to destroy my peace of mind. Instead, he had fired a brilliant flare gun directly into the night sky, revealing his entire hidden criminal operation to the federal government. I remained seated in my quiet apartment, sipping my coffee as the rain continued to fall. I did not need to see the flashing lights or hear the approaching sirens to know what was coming next. The heavy grinding gears of federal justice were finally turning, and they were completely unstoppable once set in motion. Julian Vance had built his entire empire on shifting quicksand, and Evan Garrison had unwittingly handed me the precise detonator needed to bring it all down. I had simply waited for the perfect moment to press the button, Clear's throat. By attempting to rescue Evan Garrison and humiliate me, Julian Vance had completely destroyed himself and everything he claimed to own. He had dragged his entire fraudulent enterprise out of the shadows and into the blinding, harsh light of a federal investigation. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force, leaving them absolutely no room to maneuver or escape. I took another slow, deep breath of the cool night air, feeling a profound and absolute sense of peace. The glowing screen of my laptop was the only light remaining in the apartment. I stared at the digital folders neatly arranged on my desktop. The trap had been tripped by Julian Vance himself, but a tripped wire only alerts the hunter. It does not secure the kill. I needed to deliver the final lethal blow before he realized he was bleeding. He had vast resources and a legion of corporate lawyers at his disposal. If he sensed the federal monitors closing in, he would scramble to shred documents, destroy hard drives, and silence his stepson. I could not give him that chance. I had to bury him under a mountain of incontrovertible proof before he even knew he was under attack. I opened my encryption software and began to drag and drop the files one by one into a secure archive. First went the high-resolution scans of the initial loan application. Evan Garrison had been incredibly careless. His forgery of my signature was sloppy and rushed, driven entirely by his desperation to maintain his affluent lifestyle. I included the forensic analysis I had quietly commissioned weeks ago, confirming the fraudulent strokes. Next, I added the banking ledgers. These were not simple monthly statements. They were the raw, unredacted transaction logs, showing the exact moment the $300,000 was illegally pulled from my home equity and pushed into the offshore holding company. Then came the routing numbers. Julian Vance believed his Cayman Island accounts were a black box, completely immune to outside scrutiny. He was arrogant and wrong. When you spend 30 years as a senior underwriter, you learn exactly how illicit money moves through international channels. You learn how to spot the invisible threads connecting clean domestic banks to dirty offshore havens. I had spent the last month tracing those threads, pulling them tight until they formed a perfect circle around his neck. I dropped the complete routing history into the archive. It detailed a decade of systemic money laundering, culminating in the massive $2 million transfer he had just initiated to buy Evan Garrison's silence. Finally, I added the absolute crown jewel of the collection. I attached the pristine audio file of Brenda's voicemail. Her arrogant, venomous confession was the absolute linchpin that tied the entire conspiracy together. She had explicitly linked the forged loan, the offshore accounts, and the impending real estate purchase in one uninterrupted breath. No defense attorney in the country could spin her words. It was a voluntary, uncooperative admission of federal wire fraud and international money laundering, spoken clearly into a recorded line. I watched the green progress bar inch across the screen as the software compressed and locked the archive behind a military-grade encryption key. The file was now a digital bomb waiting to be detonated. I leaned back in my chair and considered my next move. A lesser man might have printed this dossier and walked it down to the local police precinct. I completely dismissed that idea. Local detectives were entirely unequipped to handle a financial crime of this magnitude. Julian Vance would simply dispatch a team of expensive corporate lawyers to bury the local precinct in endless injunctions and jurisdictional disputes. He would drag the legal process out for years, leveraging his local influence and country club connections to suffocate the investigation before it ever reached a courtroom. I did not want a localized dispute. I wanted total absolute annihilation. I opened my secure email client and typed in a specific address I had kept memorized for over a decade. It belonged to a senior operative at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network in Washington. His name was Arthur. Years ago, during a massive corporate audit, I had provided Arthur with the missing documentation he needed to dismantle a corrupt investment firm. He was a ruthless, methodical federal investigator who hunted white-collar criminals with a terrifying singular focus. He did not care about local politics or wealthy influence. He cared only about the math, and the math never lied. I did not write a lengthy emotional plea. I did not bother with pleasantries or personal anecdotes. I typed a sterile, terrifyingly concise message. I outlined the exact timeline of the forgery, the specific Cayman routing numbers, and the precise timestamp of the $2 million transfer Julian Vance had executed just hours ago. I explained that the attached audio file contained a voluntary confession from a primary co-conspirator explicitly detailing the intent to launder those funds through domestic real estate. I provided the decryption key and nothing else. I rested my finger on the mouse pad. The entire history of my family was distilled into this single digital package. All the silent sacrifices, the unacknowledged labor, the endless disrespect, and the final ultimate betrayal had led to this exact moment. I did not feel a single shred of hesitation. I did not feel pity for the son who had robbed me or the ex-wife who had mocked me. They had chosen their path with open eyes, entirely consumed by their own greed. I simply pressed down and sent the file into the void. The message vanished from my screen. The transfer was instantaneous. The encrypted package bypassed every local authority, every corruptible judge, and every expensive defense attorney Julian Vance could possibly hire. It landed directly on the desk of a federal predator who was already actively monitoring the triggered wire transfer. I closed the laptop and the room plunged into total darkness. The rain had stopped outside, leaving a thick, suffocating stillness over the city. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling skyline. Somewhere out there, in a lavish glass penthouse, Evan Garrison and Brenda and Julian Vance were celebrating their imagined victory. They were drinking expensive champagne and laughing at my supposed defeat. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already vanished. They were standing on empty air, completely oblivious to the fact that the federal machinery was now locking on to their exact coordinates. The trap was no longer just sprung. The cage was permanently sealed, and the hunters had already been dispatched. I sat inside my unassuming sedan, parked on a high dirt ridge, overlooking the sprawling grounds of the luxury estate. The property was a massive monument to excess, featuring manicured botanical gardens and a sweeping stone courtyard. Julian Vance had selected this specific compound because it was the most expensive active listing in the entire county. He intended to purchase it in cash to provide Evan Garrison with an impenetrable fortress and to publicly humiliate me. Through the lenses of my binoculars, I watched the four of them standing together on the vast elevated patio. The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow over the scene, highlighting their supreme arrogance. Julian Vance was wearing a crisp white linen suit, playing the role of the benevolent billionaire, providing for his flock. Brenda stood closely beside him, smiling with a smug and radiant satisfaction. Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison were walking across the imported Italian tile, pointing at the cascading water fountains and admiring the sheer scale of their impending new life. Julian Vance reached into the silver bucket resting on a glass patio table and pulled out a heavy bottle of imported vintage champagne. I watched him effortlessly pop the cork, letting the pale liquid spill over the rim to catch the bright afternoon light. He handed a crystal flute to Evan Garrison and passed another to Brenda. They raised their glasses high in a toast to their shared victory and their newly secured future. Julian Vance truly believed he had outsmarted everyone. He was absolutely certain that the $2 million wire transfer from his offshore account had cleared successfully. He thought his stolen money was sitting safely in a local escrow account, ready to finalize the purchase of the estate. He had no idea that his funds were currently locked inside a secure federal vault and that his digital footprint had triggered a massive coordinated law enforcement response. The tranquil silence of the affluent gated neighborhood was suddenly broken by the deep, aggressive roar of heavy diesel engines. A tight convoy of matte black federal utility vehicles sped up the winding private road leading directly to the estate. They moved with absolute terrifying precision. The convoy did not slow down as it approached the ornate wrought iron gates guarding the main entrance. The lead vehicle, a reinforced tactical truck, simply rammed through the metal barrier without a moment of hesitation. The heavy iron gates buckled inward and crashed onto the stone driveway with a violent, deafening impact. The pristine illusion of their safety and extreme privilege shattered in an instant. Julian Vance froze with his crystal flute raised in the air. The champagne slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered against the stone patio. Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison spun around their faces, rapidly draining of color as the black vehicles swarmed the courtyard. The federal trucks formed a tight, overlapping perimeter, blocking every possible exit from the property. Before the heavy engines even shut off, the doors swung open and heavily armed federal agents poured out onto the estate grounds. They moved with the cold, silent efficiency of a specialized tactical unit executing a high-priority raid. They wore dark ballistic body armor and carried themselves with a purposeful, intimidating aggression. Evan Garrison immediately collapsed to his knees on the hard stone driveway. He wrapped his arms tightly around his head, trembling in absolute, overwhelming terror. His mind instantly connected the massive federal raid to his own desperate financial crimes. He was certain they had come to arrest him for forging my signature on the commercial loan documents. He tried to pull Chloe Garrison down to the ground with him, pleading for mercy and shouting that he would give all the stolen money back to the bank. He truly believed he was the center of the universe and the primary target of this massive tactical operation. The federal agents did not even look at him. They stepped swiftly around his cowering form, completely ignoring his existence. Evan Garrison was merely a minor domestic nuisance and insignificant footnote in a much larger federal investigation. The agents bypassed him entirely and advanced directly toward the elevated patio. Their focus was locked exclusively on the chief architect of the international criminal empire. They marched straight toward Julian Vance. Julian Vance frantically tried to maintain his arrogant facade. He puffed out his chest and demanded to know the meaning of the violent intrusion. He shouted that he was a wealthy, legitimate investor and threatened to call his expensive team of corporate lawyers. He warned the advancing agents that they were making a catastrophic mistake and that he personally knew powerful politicians who would ruin their careers. The lead federal agent did not slow his pace or offer a single word of explanation. He closed the remaining distance and grabbed Julian Vance violently by the lapels of his expensive white linen suit. The agent spun Julian Vance around with brutal, overwhelming force, stripping away his dignity in a fraction of a second. He slammed Julian Vance face down onto the hot metal hood of the nearest black utility vehicle. The violent impact knocked the wind out of Julian Vance, leaving him gasping for air against the dark steel. Two more agents stepped forward and forced his arms high behind his back, securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp, metallic click of the restraints echoed clearly across the silent courtyard. The lead agent loudly declared the charges, ensuring that every member of the family heard the absolute destruction of their reality. He announced that Julian Vance was being formally indicted for operating a massive multi-million-dollar financial scheme. He listed federal charges of international money laundering and extensive investor fraud. Brenda began to scream uncontrollably. She dropped her designer handbag and covered her face with her shaking hands. The wealthy, powerful husband she had flaunted to humiliate me was currently pinned to a truck like a common street criminal. Her earlier voicemail, boasting of his vast resources and mocking my lack of ambition, echoed pleasantly in my memory as her entire world evaporated before her eyes. I lowered my binoculars and placed them carefully on the passenger seat of my car. The tactical raid was over in less than 3 minutes. The agents hauled Julian Vance into the back of a secure transport vehicle and slammed the heavy metal door shut. The convoy engines roared back to life, and the black trucks rolled steadily out of the ruined gates. They left Evan Garrison, Brenda, and Chloe Garrison completely stranded on the empty patio of a luxury estate they could never afford to buy. They had absolutely no money, no credit, and no shelter left to their names. The trap I designed had closed with absolute flawless perfection. I put my car in gear and drove slowly down the hill, feeling the deep, settling quiet of absolute justice. The ride back to the city was a silent procession of shock. They had called a premium car service using an application on Brenda's phone, leaving the sprawling luxury estate far behind. The driver did not speak, and neither did his passengers. Evan Garrison stared out the window with blank, unblinking eyes. Chloe Garrison sat frozen in the back seat, clutching her arms around her chest. Brenda spent the entire hour frantically dialing the numbers of elite defense attorneys and political fixers. Julian Vance kept on his private contact list. Every single call went directly to a generic voicemail. The people who gladly drank Julian Vance imported wine and attended his lavish galas had already seen the evening news alerts. They knew the federal government had dropped a net over the offshore accounts, and they were scattering like frightened insects. They arrived at the towering glass high-rise in the center of the financial district. The doorman did not offer his usual warm greeting. He looked away as they walked through the lobby. They rode the private elevator up to the penthouse in total silence. The doors opened directly into the massive foyer. The penthouse was a monument to Brenda's absolute greed. She had decorated the vast space with priceless modern art and imported Italian marble. She believed this fortress of glass and steel made her untouchable. She believed that shedding a husband with no ambition 15 years ago had elevated her to permanent royalty. Brenda immediately walked to the massive oak desk in the study and opened her laptop. She needed liquid cash to retain a federal defense team. She logged into her primary banking portal. Her manicured fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. She navigated to the joint checking account she shared with Julian Vance. The screen refreshed and displayed a stark white page. There was no account balance. There was only a block of bold red text stating that the account was currently suspended by order of the federal government. Panic finally breached the cold exterior she had maintained since the arrest. She opened a new tab and logged into her own personal wealth management portal. These were the accounts holding the alimony and the assets she had systematically stripped from me during our divorce. She had given Julian Vance complete control over those funds a decade ago, allowing him to merge them into his offshore investment portfolio to maximize their returns. She hit the enter key and waited for the page to load. The same bold red text appeared on the screen. The federal banking authorities had not simply frozen Julian Vance's corporate accounts. Because Brenda and Evan Garrison had tied every single piece of their financial lives directly into his fraudulent empire, the government had enacted an immediate and total asset freeze. Every dollar, every stock portfolio, and every hidden reserve was locked tight inside a federal vault. Evan Garrison walked into the study just as Brenda slumped back in her chair. He looked at the computer screen and understood the red text instantly. The $300,000 fraudulent loan had been the initial spark, but the resulting explosion had incinerated everything they owned. Before Evan Garrison could open his mouth, the chime of the private elevator echoed through the penthouse. The heavy steel doors slid open and a team of federal agents stepped into the foyer. They were not wearing tactical gear like the raid team at the estate. They wore dark suits and carried thick leather briefcases. They were forensic accountants and asset seizure specialists. The lead agent walked directly into the study. He did not introduce himself or offer a sympathetic smile. He held up a thick stack of legal documents bearing the seal of a federal judge. The agent calmly informed Brenda that the entire penthouse and its contents were classified as the proceeds of a criminal because the property was purchased using laundered funds from the Cayman accounts. It was now the physical property of the United States government. He stated that a comprehensive audit had confirmed that Brenda's personal assets were completely commingled with the stolen investor funds. She had no legal right to anything inside the residence. Brenda stood up and began to scream. Her voice was shrill and desperate, echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows. She pointed her finger at the agent, demanding that he leave her home. She shouted that she was an innocent spouse and that her personal wealth was entirely separate from Julian Vance's business dealings. The agent simply stared at her with a blank, professional expression. He calmly instructed his team to begin cataloging the assets. Men in suits began placing bright red tags on the expensive artwork, the imported sculptures, and the modern furniture. Chloe Garrison walked out of the master bedroom, clutching a leather travel bag. She had instinctively packed her most expensive jewelry and designer watches into the small case, hoping to salvage a fraction of her lifestyle. A female agent intercepted her in the hallway. The agent firmly instructed Chloe Garrison to place the bag on the floor. Chloe Garrison began to cry heavy, messy tears, ruining her expensive makeup. She pleaded with the agent, claiming the jewelry consisted of personal gifts from her husband. The agent opened the bag and scanned the contents. She informed Chloe Garrison that any gifts purchased with stolen funds were subject to immediate confiscation. The agent closed the bag and handed it to a colleague. Chloe Garrison was left standing with empty hands, sobbing loudly into the quiet expanse of the penthouse. The lead agent turned back to Brenda and Evan Garrison. He checked his watch and delivered the final absolute mandate. He informed them that the premises were now an active federal crime scene and asset holding facility. They had exactly 10 minutes to exit the building. They were permitted to take only the clothes they were currently wearing. Evan Garrison did not argue. The arrogant swagger he had carried for years was completely eradicated. He looked like a hollow shell of a man. He turned and walked slowly toward the elevator, pulling a weeping Chloe Garrison gently by the arm. Brenda stood frozen behind the oak desk, staring at the red tags accumulating on her priceless possessions. The empire she had built on betrayal and stolen ambition was being dismantled right in front of her eyes. An agent stepped forward and firmly guided her toward the door. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the lobby opened and expelled them onto the wet city pavement. The rain had started again, falling in a cold, steady drizzle. The three of them stood under the dim glow of a street lamp, shivering in the damp night air. They had no phones, no credit cards, and no cash. They had absolutely nowhere to go. They were standing on the cold concrete, stripped of every illusion and every stolen luxury, left with nothing but the bitter reality of their own devastating choices. Exactly 7 days had passed since the dinner. 7 days since Evan Garrison had stood in his tailored suit and smirked while Brenda mocked the very foundation of my existence. I sat in the deep comfort of my armchair, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. The heat from the thick porcelain seeped into my palms, providing a steady grounding anchor against the violence of the storm outside. A torrential downpour was hammering the city. The rain did not fall in a gentle shower. It lashed against the reinforced glass of my living room window with a heavy, aggressive rhythm. The wind howled through the narrow, concrete corridors of the apartment complex, bending the streetlights and flooding the gutters. Inside my apartment, the air was warm and perfectly still. The silence was not empty. It was rich with the profound satisfaction of a closed ledger. Over the past week, I had watched the spectacular public collapse of Julian Vance and his fraudulent empire. The federal authorities had moved with a swift, ruthless efficiency that left absolutely no room for negotiation. The evening news broadcasts had been dominated by footage of black utility vehicles seizing properties and federal agents carrying boxes of financial records out of towering glass office buildings. The reporters detailed the freezing of international accounts and the immediate nullification of all domestic assets tied to the criminal syndicate. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the bitter, dark liquid wash over my tongue. I knew exactly what that federal freeze meant for the people who had treated me like a disposable stepping stone. Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison had been forcibly removed from their luxury rental. Brenda had been locked out of her pristine penthouse. Their bank cards had been deactivated instantly, turning their plastic wealth into useless garbage. The society friends who had eagerly consumed Julian Vance's imported champagne had vanished like smoke. The country club gates were firmly padlocked against them. They were entirely isolated, wandering through a city that no longer recognized their existence. They had spent the last week experiencing the exact reality I had endured for decades. The harsh, unforgiving cold of a world that demands actual labor to survive. I had built my life drop by drop through exhausting shifts at the chemical plant, saving every dollar while wearing cheap boots and driving a rusted truck. Brenda had despised that life. She had despised me for providing it. She had stolen half of my hard-earned stability in the divorce and used it to buy her way into a hollow kingdom of glass and lies. Now that glass had shattered completely, severing her from the illusions she worshipped. The silence of my living room was abruptly shattered. The sharp digital tone of my cell phone pierced the quiet warmth vibrating violently against the polished wood of the side table. I did not flinch. I slowly lowered my coffee mug and turned my head to look at the glowing screen. The harsh white light illuminated the dark corner of the room. The caller ID flashed a single name, Brenda. The name pulsed on the screen, demanding my immediate attention. It was a phantom reaching out from a past I had systematically dismantled. For 15 years, that woman had not dialed my number. She had communicated only through expensive attorneys or condescending emails forwarded by her assistants. She had considered me beneath her notice, a pathetic relic of a life she had successfully escaped. The sheer magnitude of her desperation was suddenly made tangible by the simple ringing of the phone. The digital tone chimed a second time, loud and demanding. I knew exactly why she was calling. It was not a call born of remorse or a sudden realization of her own monstrous failures. Brenda was incapable of genuine introspection. She was calling because I was the absolute last name in her contact list that had not blocked her number. She was calling because the rain was hammering the city streets, and she had nowhere left to hide from the storm. The offshore money was gone. The penthouse was seized. Julian Vance was sitting in a federal holding cell, facing decades in a maximum security facility. She was standing in the freezing downpour, completely stripped of her armor. The phone rang a third time. The sound was a desperate physical plea, echoing the exact rhythm of the rain lashing against my window. I stared at the glowing letter spelling out her name. I remembered the cold, sterile mediation room, where she had looked at me with absolute disgust. I remembered her telling the lawyers that my lack of ambition was suffocating her potential. I remembered the venom in her voicemail just a few days ago, promising that her new husband would buy my son an estate simply to humiliate me. She had wanted to destroy my spirit. She had wanted me to die alone and forgotten. Now she was the one drowning in the cold and the dark. The phone chimed a fourth time. The automated voicemail system was seconds away from engaging and cutting the connection. I reached out and let my fingers rest over the glowing screen. I did not feel a single trace of pity. I did not feel the lingering weakness of a man who had once promised to protect her. The naive underwriter who had tolerated her endless demands was long dead. He had been replaced by the architect of her absolute ruin. I picked up the phone. I pressed the green icon and lifted the speaker to my ear. I did not say hello. I did not offer a comforting greeting. I remained perfectly silent, letting the quiet hum of the open connection bridge the distance between my warm sanctuary and the freezing reality of her collapse. I sat in the darkness of my apartment, listening to the heavy static of the line, waiting for the woman who had stolen my past to beg for her future. Through the speaker, I heard the unmistakable sound of violent, chaotic weather. The roar of the torrential rain masked the background noise of passing traffic. And then, piercing through the interference of the storm, I heard the ragged, frantic breathing of the woman who had tried to erase my existence. The silence stretched between us, taut and vibrating with an agonizing tension. She was waiting for me to speak, to offer her a lifeline, to give her the argument she desperately needed to validate her victimhood. I denied her that comfort. I held the phone to my ear, took another slow sip of my black coffee, and let my silence become the heaviest, most suffocating weight she had ever carried. I pressed the phone against my ear and listened to the digital connection bridge, our two completely different worlds. The sound of the torrential rain pouring over the city streets immediately flooded the tiny speaker. Beneath the heavy static of the storm, I could hear the sharp, ragged gasps of a woman struggling to pull air into her lungs. Brenda was sobbing with a profound, unrestricted hysteria that I had never heard from her before. It was not the calculated weeping she used to manipulate divorce attorneys, or the theatrical tears she deployed to win arguments. This was the raw animal panic of someone who had just watched her entire universe collapse into dust. She tried to speak, but her words dissolved into a chaotic mess of choked breathing and violent shivering. I remained perfectly still, seated in my warm armchair, letting her experience the suffocating weight of my silence. I took a slow breath and waited for her to find her voice. She finally managed to form a coherent sentence. She spoke my name in a fragile, trembling whisper that sounded like a desperate plea for salvation. She began to pour out the details of her absolute ruin, as if confessing her sins to a judge. Her voice cracked as she explained how the federal agents had swarmed the penthouse. She described the terrifying speed of the raid and how men in dark suits had placed seizure tags on every single piece of furniture and every piece of expensive art she had carefully curated. She told me they had taken Julian Vance away in handcuffs and that the agents had explicitly forbidden her from accessing any of their bank accounts. She was completely oblivious to the fact that I was the architect of this entire operation. She believed she was simply caught in a catastrophic run of bad luck, and she was reaching out to the only person she thought was naive enough to save her. Brenda continued, her frantic narrative describing the ultimate humiliation of their sudden eviction. She told me the federal authorities had given them less than 10 minutes to vacate the premises. They were escorted into the lobby by armed guards and forced out into the freezing rain. She described their current location with a pathetic sense of disbelief. She told me that she and Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison were huddled together under a rusted metal bus stop shelter just a few blocks from the financial district. She said the wind was driving the freezing rain directly into their faces, ruining their expensive designer clothes and soaking them all to the bone. She mentioned that Chloe Garrison was crying uncontrollably and that Evan Garrison was simply sitting on the wet concrete bench, staring blankly at the passing traffic. They were completely stranded, without a single dollar to their names, waiting in the dark for a rescue that was never going to arrive. Then came the pivot I knew was inevitable. Brenda shifted her tone from pure panic to a desperate form of bargaining. She begged me for a temporary financial loan. She pleaded for me to transfer just enough money to secure a block of hotel rooms for the night. She promised she would pay me back. The moment the bank cleared up what she still stubbornly believed was a massive clerical error. She tried to sound reasonable and practical, but the violent shivering in her voice betrayed her absolute terror. When my silence stretched on without a single word of comfort, she played her final desperate card. She invoked the concept of our shared history. She told me that despite our past differences, we were still a family. She said that Evan Garrison was my son, and that a father could never abandon his child to suffer on the streets in a freezing storm. I listened to her use the word family and felt a profound sense of absolute closure. She had spent the last 15 years actively destroying the very concept of our family. She had poisoned my son against me, teaching him to view my honest labor with absolute contempt. She had encouraged him to forge my signature and steal my hard-earned equity simply to fund a lavish lifestyle she felt entitled to possess. They had both treated me as a disposable resource, a silent bank to be drained and discarded whenever it suited their needs. They only remembered the word family when their stolen wealth evaporated, and they found themselves standing in the cold. I realized then that she was not asking for a father to rescue his son. She was asking for a host to sustain a parasite. I finally spoke to her. My voice was calm and steady, completely devoid of anger or malice. I did not yell or gloat or reveal my role in their sudden destruction. I simply stated the cold facts of our reality. I told her that she had chosen her new husband and his offshore empire with open eyes. I reminded her that she had spent years mocking my modest life and praising the vast resources she was now begging me to replace. I explained that she and Evan Garrison had made a conscious, deliberate choice to sever our ties the moment they decided my financial ruin was an acceptable price for their luxury. I told her that the consequences of those choices were now entirely hers to bear. Brenda began to scream into the phone, begging and demanding that I show some basic human mercy. She called me cruel and heartless, refusing to accept the reality of her own actions. I did not raise my voice to interrupt her frantic accusations. I waited patiently for her to pause for breath. When the line fell quiet, except for the sound of the pouring rain, I delivered my final statement. I told her that she had built her house on stolen ground and that she would have to learn how to survive the storm on her own. I moved the phone away from my ear as she began to sob uncontrollably once again. I pressed the red icon on the screen and severed the connection, permanently cutting her out of my life and leaving her to face the cold, dark city she had tried to conquer. The sound of the rain pouring over the phone speaker was heavy and relentless. Beneath the static of the storm, I could hear the sharp, ragged gasps of a woman struggling to pull air into her lungs. Brenda was babbling now, her words tumbling over one another in a chaotic mess of panic and denial. She was talking about high-priced lawyers making mistakes about how Julian Vance was completely framed and how they just needed a small bridge loan to survive the weekend. I let the silence stretch, allowing her to exhaust her frantic momentum. I took a slow breath, centering myself in the quiet warmth of my apartment. I did not feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt a profound, chilling clarity that settled deep into my bones. When her frantic pleading finally dissolved into a series of wet, choking gasps, the line grew quiet. She was waiting for the familiar dynamic to take hold. She was waiting for the man who used to absorb her anxiety and solve her problems without question. The man who had worked double shifts at the chemical plant to ensure she never had to worry about a single bill. She fully expected me to sigh, to scold her gently, and then to ask for the routing numbers so I could wire her the last of my hard-earned savings. That was the pathetic, predictable script she had written for us decades ago. But I had burned that script entirely. I pressed the phone closer to my ear. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject a single trace of anger or vindictiveness into my tone. I spoke with the sterile, measured precision of a surgeon making a final necessary incision. I called her name softly, letting the word hang in the quiet space between us. It was the first word I had spoken to her in a week. The sound of it seemed to freeze the very air on the line. She let out a small, desperate whimper, a sound of fragile hope, completely misinterpreting my calm demeanor. She thought my quiet tone signaled surrender. She thought I was preparing to rescue her from the freezing downpour. I drew a breath and began to dismantle her final illusion. I told her that I could not help her. The words were flat and carried absolutely no emotional weight. I heard her draw a sharp breath, preparing to launch into another aggressive tirade of begging and manipulation. Before she could form a single syllable, I continued, cutting her off with the absolute, undeniable truth of her own making. I reached into my memory and pulled out the exact sentences she had hurled at me just 7 days prior, back when she stood in her pristine penthouse and laughed at my supposed defeat. I recited her words slowly, ensuring every single syllable landed with devastating accuracy. I told her that I was just a loser who did not know how to win in the real world. Through the speaker, the sound of the storm seemed to suddenly fade, replaced by a profound, echoing silence from her end. The realization was striking her like a physical blow. She remembered saying those exact words. She remembered the supreme contempt in her voice when she declared that my honest, blue-collar life was a pathetic failure compared to the brilliant, aggressive financial maneuvering of her new husband. I did not stop. I drove the blade deeper, twisting it into the very foundation of her arrogance. I told her that she would have to rely on her new husband for a bailout. I mirrored the exact cadence and inflection she had used to dismiss my entire existence. The silence on the line became absolute. It was the silence of total, inescapable comprehension. In that singular, monumental moment, her mind finally connected the impossible dots. She realized that my calm demeanor was not born of ignorance. She realized that the sudden, catastrophic destruction of her husband's empire was not a random act of federal scrutiny or incredibly bad luck. She realized that the loser she had mocked had meticulously engineered her absolute ruin. A long, agonizing pause stretched across the digital connection. Then a new sound emerged from the speaker. It was not a sob or a plea for mercy. It was a low, guttural gasp of pure, unadulterated horror. The illusion of the random universe had shattered completely, replaced by the terrifying knowledge that she had deliberately provoked the architect of her own downfall. She had handed me the audio confession on a silver platter. Evan Garrison had handed me the careless forgery. Julian Vance had handed me the digital wire transfer, and I had simply taken their supreme arrogance and woven it into a flawless, inescapable trap. Her voice broke through the static, barely a whisper, stripped of every ounce of entitlement and superiority she had carried for a decade and a half. She breathed my name and accused me of causing the raid. She finally understood that the federal agents, the seized bank accounts, the padlocked penthouse, and the freezing rain currently soaking her designer clothes were all the direct, unavoidable consequences of her own venomous hubris. She understood that I had possessed the power to destroy them for weeks, and had simply waited for them to step onto the trapdoor before pulling the lever. I did not confirm or deny her realization. I did not need to offer a dramatic, villainous monologue to validate her terror. The silence was my absolute confirmation. It was heavy and crushing. I told her quietly that she had nothing left because she had built everything on nothing. I told her she had chosen a phantom empire and now the ghost had vanished, leaving her with the reality she deserved. I commanded her to never call my number again. I did not wait for a response. I did not want to hear the screaming that would inevitably follow her complete psychological collapse. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the disconnect button. The screen went dark, severing the link to their miserable, collapsing world. I set the phone face down on the polished wood of the side table. The sudden quiet in my apartment was profound and deeply comforting. Outside the window, the torrential rain continued to hammer the city, washing the dirty streets clean. Somewhere in that freezing downpour, Brenda, Evan Garrison, and Chloe Garrison were standing under a rusted bus shelter, entirely alone, facing the terrifying reality of a world that owed them absolutely nothing. They had tried to push me into the abyss only to discover I had already mapped the darkness and learned how to navigate the fall. I picked up my ceramic mug, took a long, satisfying sip of my black coffee, and watched the violent storm rage against the unyielding glass. The phone vibrated across the polished wood of the side table once more. I had just severed the connection, but the parasite was not willing to let go of its host easily. The screen illuminated the dark room with the exact same caller identification. I answered the call, and instead of Brenda, a completely different voice flooded the speaker. It was Evan Garrison. He had snatched the device from his mother's trembling hands in a final desperate bid for survival. The composed, arrogant young man, who had forged my signature with casual disdain, was completely gone. In his place was a terrified child, weeping uncontrollably into the receiver. His voice pitched and cracked in chaotic waves of absolute panic. He was breathless and choking on his own tears as the freezing rain battered him in the background. He called me Dad over and over again, wielding the word as if it possessed a magical property that could instantly erase months of calculated betrayal. He unleashed a flood of frantic, hurried apologies. He swore that he never meant to hurt me and that he had been blinded by the money. He claimed that Julian Vance had manipulated him and that Brenda had pressured him into making a terrible mistake. He offered every possible excuse to shed his own guilt and paint himself as an innocent victim caught in a storm he did not understand. Then came the core of his desperate plea. He did not ask for a lawyer or for advice on how to navigate the massive federal charges looming over his head. He asked for immediate comfort. He begged me to let him and Chloe Garrison come to my apartment. He pleaded for the use of the spare bedroom just for a few nights until they could figure out their next move. He promised they would be quiet and respectful. He promised he would get a job and pay me back for the forged loan. He was standing in the freezing rain, completely stripped of his stolen luxury, and he simply wanted me to provide a warm bed and a hot meal. I sat in the dim light of my living room and listened to the son I had raised. I listened closely for a single ounce of genuine remorse. I listened for a man taking absolute responsibility for his own actions. I found nothing but cowardice and entitlement. Evan Garrison was not apologizing for committing a federal crime or for nearly destroying my financial stability. He was not apologizing for viewing me as a pathetic loser who stood in the way of his glorious future. He was only apologizing because the federal agents had seized his penthouse and frozen his bank accounts. He was crying because he was wet and cold and afraid. He simply wanted to crawl back into the protective shelter he had so eagerly tried to destroy. I allowed his frantic weeping to fill the quiet space of my apartment for several long minutes. I let him completely exhaust his supply of meaningless promises and hollow apologies. When his voice finally reduced to a series of ragged, pathetic gasps, I delivered my response. I kept my tone perfectly level and completely devoid of warmth. I told him that he was speaking to a ghost. I told him that the father he was begging to rescue him had died the very moment he forged my signature on that commercial loan document. I heard him draw a sharper breath, preparing to argue, but I did not afford him the opportunity. I calmly dismantled his entire desperate strategy. I addressed his specific request for the spare bedroom. I informed him that the room no longer existed. I explained that the comfortable apartment he remembered was currently completely empty. I told him that the furniture had been donated and the personal belongings had been packed away in boxes. I described the bare walls and the echoing floorboards, proving that my departure was not a sudden reaction, but a meticulously planned exit. I delivered the final master stroke with absolute surgical. I told Evan Garrison that I had quietly sold the entire apartment building 2 days ago. I had executed a discreet cash transaction with the corporate buyer, completely liquidating the last remaining asset tying me to this city. I explained that the funds were already secured in a private trust completely insulated from the collateral damage of his federal crimes. He gasped into the receiver, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. The realization that I had anticipated his failure and removed his last possible safety net hit him with staggering force. I did not stop there. I painted the final picture of his absolute isolation. I told him that my bags were already waiting by the front door. I explained that I was currently holding a one-way ticket to a remote coastal community miles away from the city and its toxic ambitions. I informed him that I had purchased a small, quiet property by the ocean, where the air was clean and the neighbors minded their own business. I told him that my new life would begin at sunrise and that he would have absolutely no part in it. Evan Garrison began to scream my name, begging me to reconsider. He pleaded that he had no money and nowhere to sleep. He shouted that the federal agents were going to arrest him, and he needed my help to hire a defense attorney. I listened to his panic and felt a profound sense of liberation. I told him that he was an adult who had made his own choices. I told him he would now learn the true cost of survival in the real world he claimed to master. I informed him that my new number would be permanently unlisted. I told him this was the last time he would ever hear my voice. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I did not wait for his final desperate plea to finish. I pressed the disconnect button and silenced Clear's throat, his weeping forever. I sat quietly for a moment, feeling the heavy device in my hand. I removed the protective case and slid my thumbnail into the tiny groove on the side of the phone. I popped the small tray open and extracted the silver memory chip. It was the final digital tether connecting me to a family that had viewed me only as a resource to be exploited. I held the tiny chip between my thumb and forefinger. I applied a brief, deliberate pressure and snapped the brittle plastic directly in half. I dropped the broken pieces into the ceramic mug of black coffee, letting them sink into the dark, bitter liquid. The physical act of severance was completely finalized. The apartment descended into an absolute profound silence. Outside the window, the torrential rain continued to wash the city streets clean. Inside, I closed my eyes and breathed in the quiet air, preparing to leave the darkness behind and walk out into the dawn. 6 months passed. The passage of time is a quiet and relentless force. It buries the noise of the past and leaves only the absolute truth in its wake. I sat on the wooden porch of my new coastal cabin. The morning sun was bright and warm against my face. The air smelled of salt and damp pine needles. A gentle breeze blew off the ocean water, carrying the rhythmic sound of crashing waves. There were no sirens here. There were no crowded elevators or screaming neighbors. There was only the vast and empty horizon stretching out forever. I held a ceramic mug of dark coffee in my hands. The heat seeped into my skin. I took a slow breath and felt a profound and permanent sense of peace. My life belonged entirely to me again. I set the coffee mug down on a small wooden table. I opened the silver laptop resting on my lap. The screen illuminated the shaded corner of the porch. I connected to the secure satellite network I had installed on the roof. A single unread message waited in my encrypted inbox. The sender was William Thorne. He was the old colleague and brilliant legal mind who had quietly helped me assemble the initial strike. William Thorne did not write long or emotional letters. He dealt exclusively in facts and concrete resolutions. His message contained the final legal summary of the trap we had triggered exactly half a year ago. It was the absolute accounting of a destroyed empire. I opened the message and read the first paragraph. Julian Vance was gone. The arrogant investor, who believed he could buy his way out of any consequence, had finally met a wall of absolute federal authority. He had attempted to use his remaining hidden funds to hire a team of elite defense attorneys. The government had immediately frozen those assets as well. Stripped of his wealth and his influence, Julian Vance was left completely defenseless against a mountain of irrefutable evidence. He had been formally sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. There would be no early parole and no comfortable house arrest. He was currently sitting in a concrete cell, stripped of his linen suits and his tailored linen suits and his imported champagne. His days of manipulating vulnerable people and flaunting stolen money were permanently over. He would spend the next decade of his life taking orders from guards and staring at a steel door. I scrolled down to the next section of the report. The federal asset forfeit protocols had been executed with ruthless perfection. Every dollar connected to the offshore accounts had been seized and liquidated by the government. That included every account and property Brenda had merged into the portfolio of her new husband. She was completely bankrupt. The woman who had spent 15 years mocking my modest lifestyle was now experiencing the absolute reality of survival. William Thorne detailed her current situation with sterile precision. Brenda was living in a tiny, cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of the city. To afford her meager rent, she had been forced to take a job as a retail cashier at a discount grocery store. The woman who used to spend thousands of dollars on designer handbags was now standing on her feet for 8 hours a day, scanning barcodes and bagging canned goods. She was forced to serve the exact same working-class people she had spent her entire life despising. It was a flawless inversion of her arrogant reality. I took a slow sip of my coffee and moved to the final section of the email. It detailed the ultimate fate of Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison. Evan Garrison had foolishly believed that, because he was only a minor player in the grand scheme, he would escape the heavy consequences. He was entirely wrong. The federal investigators had traced the forged commercial loan directly back to his signature. Because the loan was intertwined with the laundered money, the Internal Revenue Service had audited his entire financial history. They hit Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison with a massive crushing tax debt and severe fraud penalties. The government had seized the remaining jewelry belonging to Chloe Garrison and liquidated their few remaining possessions to cover a fraction of the owed balance. Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison were completely destitute. They had been evicted from their luxury rental and were now leasing a damp, windowless basement suite in an industrial neighborhood. Because of his felony fraud conviction, Evan Garrison could no longer find employment in the corporate financial sector. He was permanently blacklisted from any comfortable office job. William Thorne reported that Evan Garrison and Chloe Garrison were both working grueling manual labor shifts just to make their monthly payments to the federal government. The soft hands that had casually forged my name on a legal document were now calloused and bleeding from lifting heavy boxes in a warehouse. Chloe Garrison was working late-night shifts, cleaning commercial office buildings. They were trapped in a relentless cycle of physical exhaustion and crushing debt. They were finally living the exact blue-collar life they had always thought they were too important to endure. They had wanted a kingdom built on lies, and instead they were handed a lifetime of honest, punishing labor. I finished reading the email. There were no further updates needed. The ledger was perfectly balanced. I closed the laptop and placed it on the table next to my coffee mug. I did not feel a sudden surge of vindictive joy. I did not feel the need to celebrate their suffering. I simply felt the quiet satisfaction of a restored natural order. They had tried to consume my life to fuel their own insatiable greed. I had simply stepped out of their way and allowed their own momentum to carry them over the edge. I leaned back in my wooden chair and looked out at the ocean. The tide was pulling back from the rocky shore, revealing the smooth, wet stones beneath the surface. The sky was a brilliant, unbroken blue. The heavy gray storms of the city were a lifetime away. I had survived the quiet disrespect and the ultimate betrayal by remaining perfectly still and striking only when the math guaranteed absolute destruction. I had excised the rotting tissue from my life with a single clean cut. I took a deep breath of the fresh coastal air. My days of fighting invisible wars were over. The rest of my life was finally mine to live. I sat in the quiet comfort of my wooden chair and stared at the glowing screen of the laptop. The words William Thorne had written remained suspended in the bright digital light. They were the final testament to a war fought entirely in the shadows. I read the brief sentences one last time, letting the absolute finality of the information wash over my mind. There were no lingering questions left to answer. There were no hidden clauses or unforeseen complications waiting to ambush me. The sprawling empire of deceit that had threatened to consume my entire existence had been systematically reduced to ash and scattered to the wind. I moved my hand to the tracking pad. I guided the small white arrow across the screen and hovered over the icon to discard the message. I pressed down with a single deliberate motion. The email vanished from my inbox. I navigated to the deleted folder and permanently erased the file from the system. The screen displayed a completely empty folder. It was a blank digital slate that perfectly mirrored the current state of my life. I closed the laptop and placed it softly on the small table beside my ceramic coffee mug. I leaned back and rested my hands on my knees. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of malice or vindictive joy. I waited to feel the sudden rush of triumphant adrenaline that usually accompanies a victory over a bitter enemy. I found absolutely nothing of the sort. There was no cruel satisfaction in knowing that the people who had abused my trust were now suffering in the cold reality of their own making. I did not want to celebrate their pain. I only felt the profound and immovable peace of a perfectly balanced ledger. For 15 years, the moral accounting of my family had been deeply and completely corrupted. They had drawn endlessly from my patience and my resources, while depositing nothing but contempt and betrayal. The deficit had grown so massive that it threatened to bankrupt my very soul. Now the outstanding debts had been collected in full. The accounts were closed. The monumental weight of that unbalanced equation was completely lifted from my shoulders. The rotting tissue that had infected my life for over a decade had